Dead America. Tales from the Outer Banks. The Fisherman, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0. 9:13 a.m. James moved about the kitchen with the confidence of a television celebrity chef, the sizzle of butter in the pan filling the air as he prepared breakfast. The French toast was nearly done, golden brown and perfect, just how Nancy liked it. He cracked 2 eggs into another pan, watching them bubble and firm up at the edges. Despite the cheerful domestic scene, worry creased his brow. Nancy had been sick for 3 days now, her cough worsening by the hour. He tried to convince her to see a doctor yesterday, but she'd insisted on waiting. At least today she'd finally agreed to go. James slid the spatula under the French toast, transferring it to a plate alongside the eggs. He added a small portion of fresh berries, Nancy's favorite, hoping it might tempt her appetite. After pouring a glass of orange juice, he arranged everything on a wooden tray and carried it carefully toward their bedroom. The house was quiet except for Nancy's occasional coughing fits echoing down the hallway. James paused outside the bedroom door, taking a deep breath before pushing it open with his shoulder. "I hope you're hungry, honey," he announced, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. Nancy was propped against the pillows, her face pale and drawn. A string of heavy coughs racked her body as she struggled to sit up straighter, finally managing to position herself. "While I appreciate the effort, my dear, I'm not really in the mood to eat anything," she replied, her voice hoarse. James shook his head, placing the tray on the nightstand beside her. "Nonsense. Every time I've been sick over the last 25 years, you've told me to suck it up and start inhaling food, because the best way to beat a cold is to feed it." More coughing erupted from Nancy, her body shaking with each spasm. When the fit subsided, she grimaced, clearly in pain. "I'm afraid that this is a little more than just a cold," she managed. James frowned, adjusting the pillows behind her. "Don't tell me that, or else I'll go fix you a side of hash browns." Nancy forced out a laugh, which quickly transformed into another painful coughing bout. After recovering, she managed to get herself fully seated. James placed the tray across her lap, watching as she picked up a fork with trembling fingers. She began to eat, choking down small bites even though it was clearly an effort. James sat on the edge of the bed, observing how she winced with each movement. The dark circles under her eyes and the sheen of sweat on her forehead worried him more than he wanted to admit. "You know I can always call Brooks and tell him we'll fish another time," James offered, his voice soft. Nancy's eyes flashed with determination. "No, you're going fishing today." "But honey," James began. "I said you're going fishing today." Nancy's forceful tone triggered another coughing fit, violent enough that James reached for the glass of water. She held up a finger, stopping him until she could catch her breath. "You look forward to this trip with Brooks every year, and you're not missing it on my account," she continued, her voice weaker but still resolute. James sighed, shoulders slumping in reluctant acceptance. They'd had this trip planned for months, an annual tradition stretching back more than 2 decades. But leaving Nancy alone in this condition felt wrong. "Okay, but how are you going to get to the doctor if I'm not here? You're not exactly in a condition to drive," he pointed out. Nancy took a small sip of orange juice before answering. "My sister is coming by after lunch to take me." James couldn't help but groan. "Your sister, huh? You know, if I'm not here taking care of you, then she's going to badmouth me to your mother." A genuine smile briefly lit Nancy's face. "Well, my dear, she's going to badmouth you to my mother regardless, so you might as well get some fishing in." James contemplated this, finally shrugging his shoulders and letting out a laugh. "That's a valid point." He leaned down, pressing his lips against her fevered forehead. The heat radiating from her skin intensified his concern, but he kept his expression neutral as he pulled back. "I love you, Nancy. Get to feeling better." Nancy patted his hand, her eyes softening. "I love you too, James. Now get out there and catch us some dinner." "Yes, ma'am," James nodded, giving her one last lingering look before heading for the door. The fishing gear was already packed and waiting by the front door. James grabbed his tackle box and poles, carrying them out to his pickup truck. He loaded everything into the bed, securing it with bungee cords before climbing into the cab. As he backed out of the driveway, he glanced up at their bedroom window, half expecting to see Nancy watching him leave. The curtains remained drawn. James sat there for a moment, his hand on the gear shift, debating whether he should go back inside. This wasn't just any cold. Her cough had a wet, thick quality to it that worried him, and the fever, it seemed worse this morning than it had last night. Maybe he should stay home just to be safe. Brooks would understand. But Nancy would be furious if he canceled. She'd insist she was fine, that her sister would take care of everything. Besides, they'd been looking forward to this trip for months. One last day on the water before winter set in. James shifted the truck into drive and pulled away from the curb. Nancy's sister would be there in a few hours. Everything would be fine. The streets of their coastal town were relatively quiet, typical for a fall morning. A few locals walked along the sidewalks, and the occasional car passed by. The sky was overcast but bright, with seagulls circling overhead, their cries carrying on the salt-tinged breeze. James drove across town, following the familiar route to Brooks's vacation house. The small bungalow sat 2 blocks from the beach, its weathered blue paint standing out among the newer, more upscale homes that had sprung up in recent years. He pulled into the driveway and honked the horn twice. A moment later, Brooks appeared on the upper deck, waving enthusiastically before disappearing inside. James drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting. Brooks emerged from the front door a minute later, hauling his fishing gear. He was grinning from ear to ear, his salt and pepper hair tousled by the breeze. "There he is. It's been too long, man," Brooks called out as he approached the truck. James helped him load his equipment into the back. "Tell me about it. How was the drive down from Charlotte?" Brooks chuckled, climbing into the passenger seat. "The missus decided to stay home, so it was the most peaceful drive I've had in years. There's just something about a man on the open road, alone, with rock music turned up to 11. With the way my hearing is, it has to be up to 11 so I can hear it," James replied. Both men laughed as James pulled back onto the road, heading toward the marina. They fell into comfortable conversation, Brooks asking about business at James's boat repair shop, while James inquired about Brooks's retirement. "So, how's Nancy doing?" Brooks asked as they neared the marina. "You mentioned she wasn't feeling well when we talked the other day." James's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "She's been better. Got some kind of bug that's knocked her down pretty hard. But you know Nancy, tough as nails. Her sister's coming by to take her to the doctor today." "Sounds like you got the better end of that deal," Brooks joked. "A day fishing or a day with her sister, not much of a contest." James chuckled, but the sound lacked his usual warmth. "Yeah, well, Nancy insisted, said there was no way I was missing our annual trip." They arrived at the marina, the water glittering under the late morning sun. A few boats were heading out, while others were already returning with the morning's catch. James parked in his usual spot near the entrance, and they unloaded their gear. The security guard, a paunchy older man who'd worked at the marina for years, gave them a half-hearted wave as they walked past his booth. James nodded in response, leading Brooks down the wooden dock toward his boat. Most of the slips were occupied, vessels of various sizes bobbing gently in the water. They made their way to the middle section, where James's pride and joy awaited them. It wasn't the newest or most impressive boat in the marina, but it was well maintained and had served him faithfully for over a decade. "Is it just me, or does this old girl look better than she did last year?" Brooks asked, running his hand appreciatively along the boat's hull. James smiled, feeling a flush of pride. "You got a good eye. I had her touched up after last year's trip. Cost me a pretty penny, but it should give me another 10-15 years with the old girl." Brooks hefted his tackle box onto the deck, then paused, a mischievous glint in his eye. "So, how did you break it to Nancy?" "I didn't," James replied. Both men broke into laughter as they climbed aboard. James moved to the steering console, checking gauges and switches while Brooks stowed their gear. Despite his concern for Nancy, James found himself slipping into the familiar rhythms of preparation, his mind focusing on the tasks at hand. The weather was perfect for fishing, not too hot, with just enough cloud cover to keep the sun from beating down on them. The forecast had mentioned possible storms later in the evening, but they'd be back well before then. James started the engine, its vibration rumbling beneath his feet. He untied the mooring lines while Brooks took a position at the bow, ready to push off from the dock if needed. "All right, you ready to hit the high seas?" James called out, easing the throttle forward. Brooks reached into the cooler, pulling out a beer. He popped it open with a satisfying hiss, raising it high in a toast. "Let's do it, my friend." James guided the boat smoothly away from the dock, navigating through the marina at a respectful speed. Once they cleared the no-wake zone, he opened up the throttle and the vessel surged forward, cutting through the gentle waves of the bay. The shoreline began to recede behind them, the town's buildings growing smaller against the backdrop of coastal hills. James felt the familiar exhilaration of being on the open water, the cool spray occasionally misting his face as they headed toward the ocean. For now, at least, his worries about Nancy were pushed to the back of his mind. She was right. They'd been planning this trip for months, and her sister would take good care of her. There would be plenty of time to fuss over her when he got home, hopefully with a cooler full of fresh fish for dinner. Chapter 2. 4:23 p.m. The day on the ocean had been fruitful, as the two longtime friends had half a cooler's worth of fresh fish sitting at the bow of the boat. The clear autumn sky reflected brilliantly off the water's surface, creating a peaceful backdrop to their day at sea. They had ventured several miles offshore, finding the yellowfin just where James had promised they would be. The afternoon had passed in the easy rhythm of cast, wait, reel, and occasional celebration when one of them landed a good-sized catch. It was the kind of day that reminded James why he loved the ocean so much. The gentle rocking of the boat beneath his feet, the salt spray misting his face, and the simple pleasure of fishing alongside an old friend. Brooks stood at the port side, concentration etched on his weathered face as he worked his line. James watched as his friend's rod bent sharply, indicating a solid bite. Brooks leaned back, beginning the careful dance of reeling in his catch. "I think I got a big one," Brooks called out, excitement coloring his voice. James set his own rod aside, moving closer to watch. "Don't lose him now." Brooks continued the struggle, arms straining against the resistance. For a moment, it seemed certain that he would land the fish. Then, suddenly, the tension disappeared, the line going slack. "Dang it, almost had him," Brooks exclaimed, frustration evident in his tone. James chuckled, picking up his own rod and reeling in his line. As it approached the surface, a flash of silver caught his eye. He pulled the line up and over the side of the boat, revealing a fish so small it barely qualified as a catch. The two men looked at it for a moment before breaking into laughter at the tiny stature of the creature. "Well, look at the bright side. That thing is almost big enough to be bait," Brooks teased, his earlier disappointment forgotten. James held up the minuscule fish proudly. "It's bigger than what you caught, though." "Yeah, well, that thing's so small I'm not sure I'd want to claim I caught it," Brooks shot back. James looked at it for another moment, shaking his head at the absurdity before carefully unhooking it. He held the tiny fish over the water. "There you go, little fella. Get big so I can catch you next time out," he said, releasing it with a gentle toss. The fish splashed down, disappearing into the blue depths. Brooks reached into the nearby cooler, plunging his hand into the ice to extract another beer. The cans clinked together as he rummaged around. "Do you want one?" Brooks offered, holding up a dripping can. James glanced at his watch, seeing the late afternoon time displayed on its face. He debated internally for a moment. He'd already had a couple earlier, but the buzz had mostly worn off. Plus, Nancy wouldn't be expecting him home for at least another couple of hours. "Yeah, what the hell, one more ain't gonna hurt anybody," he decided with a nod. "That's my boy," Brooks grinned, tossing the beer over. James caught it deftly, popping the tab and taking a long swig. The cold liquid slid down his throat, refreshing against the salt air. Brooks raised his own can in a toast, and they clinked their beers together before settling back into their fishing positions. "So what do you think? Stay out here another hour, then head back in?" James asked, rebaiting his hook. Brooks cast his line out into the water with a practiced flick of his wrist. "We're what? Half an hour back to the docks?" "Half an hour if this is my last beer. 45 minutes if I have another one," James replied with a smirk. Brooks chuckled as he adjusted his grip on the rod. "You're the one with the sick missus at home, so I'm on your schedule." James considered this for a moment. Nancy had said her sister would come by after lunch to take her to the doctor. By now, they'd be back at the house, Nancy probably resting while her sister puttered around, finding new things to criticize about James's housekeeping. We better give it 45 minutes. I don't want to risk running into her sister, he decided. Nancy is such a wonderful woman. How in the world is her sister such a... Brooks trailed off, not sure of how to finish the thought without being crude. James snorted, taking another sip of his beer. Such a bitch. Don't worry, what we say doesn't leave this boat. Brooks laughed, relief evident in his expression. Fair enough, but how is she so different from her sister? Your guess is as good as mine, James replied with a shrug. He'd spent 25 years trying to win over Nancy's sister, to no avail. Come on, man, you must have done something to get her against you like that, Brooks pressed. James leaned back, the memory of the first tense Thanksgiving dinner with Nancy's family surfacing in his mind. The best I can tell is that she thought Nancy deserved better. Well, hell, I could have told you that, Brooks replied. Both men chuckled as James gave a friendly middle finger, the familiar banter loosening the knot of worry that had settled in his chest since leaving Nancy that morning. I'm serious, though. Nancy was smart enough to be a doctor or lawyer, and I guess her sister blames me for that not happening, James continued, his tone more thoughtful. Brooks shook his head, setting his beer down on the small table between them. Her sister is nuts. You supported Nancy every step of the way, no matter what she wanted to do. It was true. When Nancy had decided to quit her accounting job to pursue painting full-time, James had reworked their entire budget to make it possible. When she'd later chosen to teach art at the local community center instead, he'd been equally supportive. You're more than welcome to come to dinner tonight and tell her that yourself, James offered with a grin. Brooks' face took on a look of mock horror. Based on what you've told me about her, I'm going to need something stronger than beer to get me through the evening. Both men broke into laughter again, the sound carrying across the open water. James was about to respond when a burst of static interrupted them. The radio near the controls screeched to life, a panicked man's voice cutting through the white noise. Please, for the love of God, is anybody out there? Brooks and James exchanged worried glances before moving quickly to the radio. Even through the crackling static, the terror and panic in the man's voice were unmistakable. James grabbed the handset, pressing the talk button. I got you, buddy. What's going on? There was a moment of silence before the voice returned, breathless with relief. Oh, thank God, please. I need help. My wife, something's wrong with her. James and Brooks listened closely, hearing banging sounds coming from the other end of the line. The rhythmic pounding was punctuated by what sounded like moaning, though it was difficult to be certain through the static. What's wrong with her? James asked, his brow furrowing in concern. The voice hesitated, broadcasting nothing but the banging and the faint hint of moaning before responding. I don't know, just, please, I need help, the man finally said, his voice breaking. James frowned, tapping his fingers on the console. Have you called the Coast Guard? Nobody answered me. Please, I need help, the man pleaded. James looked at Brooks, raising an eyebrow in silent question. They'd been friends long enough that they could communicate without words. Brooks nodded slightly, and James turned back to the radio. Where are you at? James asked. I'm at 35.385 by minus 75.257, the man replied, his voice steadier now that help was on the way. Brooks punched the coordinates into their GPS, studying the display for a moment. They're just a couple miles from us, he confirmed, pointing to the screen. James nodded, pressing the talk button again. All right, just hang tight, buddy. We're on the way. It'll take us a few minutes to get there, though. The banging and moaning continued on the other end of the line, growing louder as if the person was closer to the radio now. Thank you, the man's voice came through once more, barely audible above the background noise. Both men moved quickly, grabbing their fishing rods and reeling them in. James set his rod in the holder and moved to the controls, starting the engine. The boat hummed to life beneath them as he pushed the throttle forward, turning them in the direction indicated by the GPS. What do you think is going on? Brooks asked, securing their loose gear as the boat picked up speed. James shook his head, eyes scanning the horizon. No idea. Could be anything. Heart attack, stroke, maybe she fell and hit her head. And what about those noises in the background? Brooks pressed. I don't know, James admitted. But if someone needs help, we can't just ignore them. The boat cut through the waves, spray kicking up along the sides as they maintained a brisk pace. Both men scanned the water ahead, looking for any sign of another vessel. After several minutes, a dot appeared on the horizon, gradually taking the shape of a small fishing boat, similar to their own. "That must be them," James said, easing back on the throttle as they approached. They drew closer, slowing to a crawl as they neared the other boat. It appeared deserted, with no movement visible on deck. The craft was drifting slightly, its engine off, and the deck empty except for some abandoned fishing gear. James grabbed the radio handset again. "Hey buddy, we're here. Where are you?" They waited, but no answer came. The silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant cry of a seagull. James tried again, raising his voice slightly. "Hello, anyone there?" Nothing but static responded. James maneuvered their boat closer, stopping about 5 yards away, close enough to see details but still maintaining a safe distance. Both men peered at the other vessel, searching for any sign of movement. "Hey, is there anybody there?" James called out, his voice carrying across the water. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, sudden movement caught their attention as a figure emerged from below deck. It was a woman, but something was terribly wrong. Her clothing was saturated with dark stains, and her face and mouth were coated with what appeared to be blood. She moved in an odd, jerking manner, her head swiveling until she spotted the two men. A sound escaped her that chilled James to the bone, a guttural, inhuman moan that rose in pitch and volume. The bloody woman lurched forward, breaking into a sprint toward the edge of her boat, facing them. Before either man could react, she hit the railing with such force that she flipped over it, plunging into the water between the vessels with a loud splash. "Jesus Christ!" Brooks exclaimed, stumbling backward in shock. The two men rushed to the side of their boat, peering anxiously into the water. The ocean's surface had already settled, showing no sign of the woman who had just fallen in. "I don't see her," James said, scanning the depths anxiously. Brooks gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles white. "Well, I'm sure as hell not jumping in to find her." They continued staring into the water, waiting for the woman to resurface, but the sea remained undisturbed. After several long moments, James turned his attention back to the other boat. "Hello, is anyone else aboard?" he called again. Still no response came from the seemingly abandoned vessel, but now that they were listening carefully, they could hear sounds, faint but unmistakable. Moaning, punctuated by rhythmic thumping, like someone pounding against a door. "Do you want to go over?" Brooks asked, his voice lower than usual. James hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn their boat around and head for home. "Not really, but I don't think we have a choice," he finally answered. Brooks sighed heavily. "I was afraid you were going to say that." With practiced precision, James maneuvered their boat alongside the other vessel. Brooks grabbed a coil of rope and tossed it over, securing a tow line around the railings to prevent the boats from drifting apart in the gentle swells. James stepped cautiously over the narrow gap between the boats, the deck shifting slightly beneath his feet as he landed. He held up his hand, signaling for Brooks to wait as he took a tentative step forward. The deck was eerily silent now, with only the creaking of the boats and the lapping of waves breaking the quiet. James moved cautiously across the deck, stopping abruptly when his foot slid slightly on the wooden planks. Looking down, he saw a large, dark stain spreading across the boards. Fresh blood, still glistening wetly in the late afternoon sun. The moaning grew louder, accompanied by a renewed banging from below deck. James motioned for Brooks to follow, pointing toward the small cabin entrance. Brooks crossed over to join him, his face pale beneath his tan. "I've got a real bad feeling about this, James." "Me too," James admitted. "But we can't just leave if someone needs help." Together they approached the cabin entrance, peering down the short staircase that led below deck. The banging grew more insistent, accompanied by that same inhuman moaning they'd heard from the woman before she went overboard. Descending cautiously, they found themselves in a small cabin area. A narrow hallway led toward the source of the noise, and they followed it slowly, every sense on high alert. The confined space amplified the sounds, making them seem to come from everywhere at once. They turned a corner and froze. At the end of the passageway was a door with a small glass window. Behind it, Visible through the smeared glass was a man, or what had once been a man. His clothes were soaked with blood, particularly around a vicious-looking wound on his neck. His eyes were vacant, devoid of any human intelligence, yet filled with a terrible hunger as he spotted them. The zombified man slammed his hands against the glass with renewed vigor, trying desperately to break through to his new prey. The door shuddered with each impact, the hinges beginning to crack under the relentless assault. James's gaze dropped to the floor beside the door, where a handheld radio lay abandoned. "Good God, is that the guy who called us?" Brooks whispered. James nodded slowly, his mouth dry. "It looks that way." "What in the hell is wrong with him?" Brooks asked, taking a half-step back as the creature behind the door redoubled its efforts. Both men stared, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before them. The man behind the door looked like something from a horror movie, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his face twisted into an expression of mindless aggression. "I don't know, but I sure as hell don't want to stick around to figure it out," James decided. As if punctuating his statement, the door frame splintered slightly, a crack appearing along one of the hinges. The creature inside seemed to sense the weakness, focusing its attacks on that spot. "Back to the boat!" James shouted, grabbing Brooks's arm. Both men turned and ran, taking the narrow stairs two at a time as they scrambled back toward the deck. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin, followed by a triumphant, hungry moan. They burst onto the deck just as the creature emerged from below, lurching toward them with surprising speed. James leaped across the gap to their boat, turning quickly to make sure Brooks made it across too. Brooks landed heavily beside him, immediately moving to untie the tow line. James pushed against the other boat with an oar, creating distance between the vessels as the zombie rushed toward them. The creature let out a final, chilling moan as it sprinted toward the edge of the boat. Like the woman before it, it failed to stop in time, toppling over the railing and plunging into the water with a splash. The two men watched as it flailed for a moment, thrashing violently before gravity pulled it beneath the surface, disappearing into the darkening depths. For a long moment neither spoke, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and their own ragged breathing. Finally, James turned to Brooks, his face grave. "Get a pot of coffee on, because I think we're going to need to sober up for this." Chapter 3. 5:23 p.m. The coffee was hot and black, strong enough to cut through the fog of alcohol and adrenaline that had clouded their thinking. Brooks emerged from below deck carrying 2 steaming mugs as James continued his attempts to reach anyone on the radio. "Come on, Coast Guard, where are you? Somebody has got to be out there," James shouted into the handset, frustration evident in his voice. The only response was the hiss of static. James had been trying various channels for the past 20 minutes without success. He slammed the handset down and accepted the coffee from Brooks, chugging half of it in a single go, despite the scalding temperature. "No luck?" Brooks asked, already knowing the answer. James grimaced, partly from the hot coffee, partly from frustration. "None. It's like everybody just picked up and called it a day." "How is that possible?" Brooks leaned against the console, cradling his mug between his hands. "I wish I knew," James replied, staring out at the abandoned boat drifting about 30 yards away. They'd put some distance between the vessels after the incident, but had remained close enough to keep an eye on it. No other movement had occurred on board since the man had gone overboard. "So what do we do?" Brooks asked after a long silence. James ran a hand through his salt-stiffened hair. "I wish I knew that too." The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. They had maybe an hour of daylight left, and James had no desire to be out on the water after dark, not with whatever was happening. "Does your cell work this far out?" Brooks suggested. James pulled his phone from his pocket, checking the screen. "Damn it. Probably won't work until we're pulling into the docks." He showed Brooks the no service message displayed on the screen. "You're thinking I should call Nancy?" "I'm thinking you should call anybody," Brooks replied, his normally jovial face serious. "Somebody who gets paid to deal with this kind of thing needs to come look at this." James took another long sip of his coffee, considering their options. Do you really think they're going to believe us when we tell them the 2 people on that boat just went crazy and dove into the water to drown? I mean, it's what happened, isn't it? Brooks countered. Yeah, but say it aloud and tell me that you'd believe that story if somebody told it to you, James challenged. Brooks started to repeat the sequence of events, getting halfway through before stopping and shaking his head in realization. Yeah, that's a load of bullshit. Exactly. So I think our story should be, we got the distress call, came out here and found the boat empty, James proposed. Brooks nodded in agreement. Good enough for me, but who do we tell it to? I'll call the police once we get closer to shore, James decided, draining the rest of his coffee and handing the empty mug back to Brooks. If you want to get us a refill, I'll get us heading back to shore. Brooks nodded and descended below decks to fill the ardor. James turned to the controls, starting the engine and setting a course back to the marina. He checked the GPS, calculating the distance. It would take them nearly an hour to reach the docks, longer than he'd hoped. As the boat pulled away, James took one last look at the abandoned vessel. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Whatever had happened on that boat wasn't natural. Those people, if they could still be called that, had acted like something out of a horror movie. James thought about Nancy, sick at home with her sister. The image of the blood-covered woman from the boat flashed in his mind, and his stomach clenched. He pushed the throttle forward, increasing their speed. The sooner they reached land and he could check on Nancy, the better. Brooks returned with fresh coffee, settling into the seat beside James. You think this is some kind of disease? Something contagious? He asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in James's mind. I don't know, James replied honestly. But I'm worried about Nancy. She's been sick since yesterday. But she didn't look like that. Brooks gestured vaguely in the direction of the abandoned boat, now a small speck on the horizon behind them. No, she didn't, James agreed. Just a bad fever and cough. Both men fell silent, lost in their own thoughts as the boat cut through the darkening waters. The mainland grew gradually larger on the horizon, and James focused on that, trying not to let his mind wander to worst-case scenarios. 6:10 p.m. The fall sun was getting low in the sky, casting long shadows across the waterfront as they approached the marina. James reduced their speed as they entered the protected waters of the harbor, moving slowly towards their docking bay. Is it just me, or does it seem really quiet out here today? Brooks asked, peering at the docks. James frowned, taking in the scene. The typical bustle of activity that characterized the marina at this hour was notably absent. No dock workers moving about, no fishermen unloading their catches, no tourists wandering along the waterfront. It's not just you, he confirmed. Usually this time of day, half of these boats would be pulling in to dock for the night. It doesn't look like most of these ever cast off today. Most of the slips were still occupied, the boats sitting idle as if it were the middle of the night rather than early evening. Maybe everybody is sick like Nancy, Brooks suggested. Could be, James replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the knot of dread in his stomach tightened with each passing minute. He guided the boat toward their usual slip with extra caution, eyes scanning the deserted docks for any sign of movement. As they approached, Brooks moved to the bow, readying the lines. James cut the engine, allowing the boat to glide the final few feet to the dock. Brooks hopped off, quickly securing the vessel with practiced efficiency. Before stepping off the boat, James pulled out his cell phone. The signal had returned, showing 3 bars of service. He dialed the local police station, putting the phone to his ear as it began to ring. After several rings, a tired-sounding voice answered. Police station, how can I help you? Yes, ma'am, my name is James, and I need to report an abandoned vessel, he stated, trying to keep his voice steady. Where is this vessel located? The receptionist asked, sounding distracted. A few miles offshore. I have the coordinates right here if you have a pen, James offered. If it's offshore, then it's not our jurisdiction, the receptionist cut in abruptly. You need to contact the Coast Guard. James felt his frustration rising. See, I tried that, but... Look, sir, the receptionist interrupted again. I can't do anything about it, even if I wanted to. I don't have the manpower tonight. It's the Coast Guard's jurisdiction. So you're going to have to call them. That's what I'm trying to tell you, James said, struggling to keep his voice level. "I've tried to raise them several times and nobody is home." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if the receptionist was considering her words. "Seems like you're not the only one dealing with that," she finally replied. "My guess is that whatever bug is going around is hitting them hard like it's hitting us. Half of my officers called out tonight." The implications of this statement sent a chill through James. If half the police force was out sick, along with the Coast Guard. "So what are we supposed to do?" he demanded. "There's an abandoned vessel floating out at sea." "Well, look at the bright side," the receptionist responded, her tone flippant. "It's abandoned and not filled with people who need help." As much as James wanted to argue, he knew she had a point. There wasn't anyone alive on that boat who needed assistance. "Okay, fine, I'll just keep trying them," he conceded. He could hear another phone ringing in the background on the other end of the line. "Thank you, sir. Have a good evening," the receptionist said hurriedly. Before James could respond, the line went dead. He lowered the phone, staring at it in disbelief. "Well, that was fruitful," he muttered. Brooks, who had been watching from the dock, raised an eyebrow. "No help?" "She said to just keep calling the Coast Guard, it's their problem," James replied, pocketing his phone. "Half their officers are out sick, apparently." "You want to give Nancy a call?" Brooks suggested. James nodded, stepping off the boat onto the dock. "I'll call her from the truck. Come on." Brooks hesitated, gesturing to the cooler full of fish they'd caught earlier. What about the cooler? Under normal circumstances, James would never have left their catch behind, especially not after a successful day of fishing, but nothing about this day felt normal anymore. "Just leave it for now. I want to get home," he decided. Brooks nodded in understanding, and the two men began walking down the wooden dock toward the parking lot. The marina remained eerily quiet, their footsteps on the boards sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. They had made it about halfway to the shore when James noticed movement near the security booth at the entrance to the docks. A lone figure emerged, moving in an oddly familiar, jerking manner that made James's blood run cold. The security guard, or what had once been the security guard, staggered into view, his head swiveling as if searching for something. Both men froze, watching as the creature turned toward the sound of their footsteps. Even from a distance, James could see the dark stains on the guard's uniform, the unnatural vacancy in his eyes. The zombified security guard let out a horrific moan before breaking into a sprint, charging directly toward them. For a critical second, both men stood paralyzed by shock. Then survival instinct kicked in. "Run, run," James shouted, already turning to flee back toward the boats. Brooks reacted first, taking off at a run with James close behind. They pounded down the wooden planks, the sound of their footfalls only encouraging the creature's pursuit. James had almost reached the midway point of the dock when disaster struck. His foot caught in a coil of rope that had been carelessly left on the boards, sending him sprawling face first onto the hard wooden surface. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, leaving him momentarily stunned. He tried to scramble to his feet, but before he could regain his balance, the zombified security guard was upon him. The creature pounced on his outstretched leg, and James felt a searing pain as teeth sank deep into his calf muscle. He cried out in agony, instinctively kicking out with his free leg. His boot connected with the zombie's face, dislodging it from his calf, but taking a chunk of flesh with it. James looked down in horror at his mangled leg, blood flowing freely from the wound, before turning his attention back to the creature. The zombie had tumbled backward but was already regaining its footing, chewing on the piece of James's leg it had torn away. Panic surged through James as he tried to crawl backward, away from the approaching threat. The creature dropped to all fours, crawling after him with predatory intent. "Watch yourself!" Brooks's voice called out from somewhere behind him. James glanced back to see his friend rushing forward, wielding a small metal anchor he had grabbed from a nearby boat. Brooks swung it with all his might, the metal arc connecting with devastating force beneath the zombie's chin. One of the sharp metal prongs punctured through the bottom of the creature's jaw and drove upward into its brain. The impact lifted the zombie off its feet, sending it flying backward onto the dock where it lay motionless. Brooks stood poised for another attack, the bloody anchor raised, but the creature didn't move. After confirming the zombie was truly down, Brooks turned his attention to his injured friend. "Jesus, man, are you okay?" he asked, his face pale with shock. "That son of a bitch bit me," James gasped, clutching his bleeding leg. Brooks knelt beside him, examining the wound. The color drained from his face as he took in the severity of the injury, a ragged, gaping hole where a significant chunk of calf muscle had been. Without a word, Brooks leapt to his feet and jumped aboard the nearest boat, disappearing inside. He returned moments later with a first aid kit, quickly ripping it open and pulling out a roll of bandages. "What in the holy hell is going on down here?" Brooks muttered as he began wrapping the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "I don't know," James replied through gritted teeth, his face contorted with pain. James winced as Brooks pulled the bandage tight, securing it around the wound. Blood immediately began to seep through, staining the white gauze crimson. "That's not going to do much for that wound, man," Brooks said, shaking his head. "We need to get you some real medical treatment." "Help me up then," James requested, extending his hand. Brooks pulled his friend to his feet, steadying him as James tested his injured leg. A sharp bolt of pain shot through him as he put weight on it, and he nearly collapsed again. Only adrenaline and Brooks's supporting arm kept him upright. "Come on, let's get you to the hospital," Brooks urged, already helping James hobble toward the shore. "It's too far away," James countered, thinking of the 30-minute drive to the nearest emergency room. "But there's a walk-in clinic a few miles from here." Brooks nodded grimly. "That'll have to do. Come on." Chapter 4. Brooks helped James to the truck, supporting most of his weight as they made their way across the parking lot. James winced with every step, the bite wound on his calf sending waves of pain up his leg. "Almost there," Brooks encouraged, adjusting his grip to make it easier for his friend. When they reached the truck, Brooks carefully helped James into the passenger seat, making sure his injured leg was positioned in a way that wouldn't cause additional pain. James leaned back against the headrest, breathing heavily, his face pale from blood loss and shock. Before getting in the driver's side, Brooks noticed something that caught his attention. There were dark smears on the window of the small guard shack near the parking lot entrance. In the deepening twilight, the stains had an unmistakable reddish-brown hue. "What in the hell are you doing, man?" James called from inside the truck, noticing Brooks's hesitation. Brooks kept his eyes fixed on the security booth. "Give me a second." "Brooks," James protested, but his friend was already walking toward the small structure. James reluctantly waited, watching with increasing anxiety as Brooks approached the guard shack. The small building stood silent, its door slightly ajar. Brooks moved cautiously, pushing the door open further and peering inside. The interior of the shack showed clear signs of a struggle. An overturned stool lay on its side, papers were scattered across the floor, and various desk items had been knocked to the ground. Blood spattered the glass of the windows and across the desk surface. Brooks scanned the small space, his eyes falling on a holstered revolver tucked underneath the desk. He reached for it, checking to see if it was loaded. The cylinder contained 6 bullets, but a quick search of the drawers yielded no additional ammunition. "Well, it's better than nothing," Brooks muttered to himself, tucking the weapon into his waistband at the small of his back. He made his way back to the truck, climbing into the driver's seat and starting the engine. The revolver pressed uncomfortably against his back as he settled into position. "Where am I going?" Brooks asked as he drove towards the main road. James shifted in his seat, trying to find a position that minimized the pain in his leg. "Get back to the main road and hang a left." The sun had fully retreated behind the horizon, casting the area in darkness. Street lights flickered on along the main thoroughfare, creating pools of yellow light at regular intervals. Brooks drove carefully, both men keeping their eyes peeled for any signs of trouble. Despite their harrowing experiences at the docks and offshore, much of the town appeared to be functioning normally. A few restaurants had customers visible through their windows, though noticeably fewer than usual for this time of evening. Several cars passed them in the opposite direction, their headlights briefly illuminating the interior of the truck. "Is it just me, or does this seem odd?" Brooks asked, breaking the tense silence that had fallen between them. James grimaced, adjusting the makeshift bandage on his leg. "I'm missing a chunk of my leg, so everything about today is odd." You know what I mean? Brooks insisted, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Yeah, I do, James conceded, watching a family enter a pizzeria as they drove past. I'm getting attacked at the docks, and people are out here having dinner like it's a normal weeknight. The disconnect was jarring, pockets of normalcy existing alongside the horror they'd witnessed. It made no sense, and that only heightened their unease. How much further is it? Brooks asked, slowing slightly at an intersection. It's about half a mile past the bridge turnoff, James directed, pointing ahead. Brooks nodded, accelerating again once they cleared the intersection. Seems like it's a bit out of the way. Vacation property takes priority down here, James explained, trying to focus on the conversation instead of the throbbing pain in his leg. Nobody wants to pay big bucks for a rental house only to have it sitting beside a walk-in clinic. Brooks chuckled at the observation. I don't know, if it got me a discount? Most people who come out to the Outer Banks don't need discounts, James replied with a weak smile. Brooks let out a laugh, shaking his head as they continued down the road. For a moment, it almost felt like a normal evening drive. Almost. Speaking of which, Brooks continued, I might need to bum a few bucks to pay for the rental. Coming to visit your ass gets more expensive every year. James forced a chuckle, appreciating his friend's attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He pointed to a mid-sized two-story building set back from the road on their left. That's the clinic. Brooks turned into the driveway, surveying the parking lot as they approached. Half a dozen vehicles were parked outside, but there was no one visible in the immediate vicinity. The clinic's lights were on, flooding out through the windows, but the frosted glass made it impossible to see what was happening inside. Brooks pulled the truck right up to the front of the building, parking in a no-parking zone without a second thought. I need you to wait in the truck, he said firmly, turning to James. What are you talking about? James asked, straightening up despite the pain. Brooks unbuckled his seatbelt. I'm going to poke my head in and make sure that everything is normal. James gave his friend a condescending look. Really, man? Well, if it will soothe your ego a bit more, Brooks countered. I'm going to go in and grab a wheelchair to wheel your ass around. James contemplated this for a moment before shaking his head. Yeah, I'm not sure that's any better. Just sit tight, Brooks insisted. I'll be right back. James reluctantly nodded, watching as Brooks got out of the truck and cautiously approached the entrance. His friend's hand hovered near his back, ready to draw the revolver if necessary. Brooks reached the door, trying to peer through the frosted glass, but it was difficult to make out details. Taking a deep breath, he pulled the door open and stepped into the vestibule. As he opened the secondary set of doors, Brooks was confronted with a scene of absolute horror. Blood covered most surfaces. The floor, chairs, walls, and a couple of bodies lay motionless on the ground. The waiting room had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. Brooks drew the handgun, keeping it at the ready as he debated whether to proceed further or retreat. Before he could turn around, he heard a voice calling out for help from somewhere in the back of the clinic. Damn it, you just had to hear that, didn't you? He muttered to himself. Steeling his nerves, Brooks moved forward, aiming the revolver at each of the corpses as he passed them, making sure they were truly down. Both had massive head wounds, and he began to understand what that might mean. He pushed through the doors that led to the main treatment area, finding it in the same chaotic state as the waiting room. Blood splattered the walls and floor, and more bodies were visible in the corners. Movement to his left caught his attention. 3 zombies were banging on an office door, trying to get to whoever was inside. Through the glass panel in the door, Brooks could see 2 people, a young man and woman, one pressed against the door to keep it closed, the other looking out frantically. The young woman spotted Brooks and began smacking the glass, trying to get his attention. Brooks held up his finger in a calming gesture, signaling for her to wait as he assessed the situation. He moved to the central nurse's station, positioning himself behind a chest-high desk that provided some protection from the creatures. Taking careful aim, Brooks cocked the hammer and fired a single shot, which struck the back of one zombie's head. The creature dropped instantly, but the gunshot alerted the other 2, who broke away from the door and rushed toward him. Brooks held his position as the zombies reached the desk, clawing at him but unable to reach across the barrier. They made no attempt to circle around, instead standing there with arms outstretched, trying to grab him. With the creatures effectively trapped in their single-minded approach, Brooks took his time. aiming carefully and firing twice more. Each shot found its mark, and both zombies crumpled to the floor. "It's clear," Brooks called out. A few seconds later, the door opened cautiously, and the two people emerged. The young woman was covered in blood that clearly wasn't her own, her scrubs splattered with crimson. The man wore civilian clothes, his face pale with fear. "Thank you so much," the man said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know what we were going to do." The woman stepped forward, her eyes wide. "What is going on?" Brooks lowered the revolver, though he didn't holster it. "I wish I knew what to tell you. Whatever it is, it's not good." The young man glanced around at the carnage. "Is it like this outside?" "Not everywhere," Brooks replied, "but I don't think it's going to stay that way for very long." The woman hugged herself, shivering despite the warmth of the building. "What do we do?" Brooks considered the question carefully before responding. "Do you have a boat?" Both of them shook their heads. "On my salary, I can barely afford a pier pass," the man said ruefully. Brooks nodded, having expected that answer. "Well, you need to find a boat, even if it's not yours, and get out to sea. Do that, and don't come back until someone tells you it's safe to." The young couple exchanged worried glances, clearly uncertain whether to trust this stranger with a gun. After looking around at the destruction surrounding them, however, they nodded in agreement. "We'll do that," the man decided. "Before you go," Brooks added, "my friend needs some medical attention. Can either of you patch up a bite?" The couple exchanged another concerned look, this one laden with unspoken knowledge. Brooks didn't notice the significance of their reaction, focused as he was on getting help for James. "Where's your friend?" the woman asked after a moment's hesitation. "I'll take care of him." "He's out in the truck," Brooks said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you." The young couple gathered a few medical supplies from nearby cabinets before heading toward the exit. Brooks watched them go, then turned his attention back to the creatures on the floor, taking in the full horror of the scene. What in the world is going on? Chapter 5. The young woman worked quickly but carefully, wrapping a fresh bandage around James's injured leg. Despite her gentle touch, James winced in pain as she pulled the wrapping tight to secure it. "I'm sorry about that, but it needs to be tight," she said, her eyes showing genuine concern. James gritted his teeth, nodding through the pain. "Do what you gotta do." They were seated just outside the clinic, using a small flashlight to illuminate their work. The young woman had insisted on treating him outdoors rather than taking him inside, a decision James was grateful for after hearing Brooks's brief description of the carnage within. As she put the finishing touches on the bandage, her friend continued looking out towards the road, his posture tense, clearly anticipating trouble. Every passing car caused him to stiffen, however. No threats materialized as they worked. "Okay, that's as good as I can make it right now. Ideally, you need a doctor to look at that." The woman trailed off, knowing that wasn't likely to happen, at least in the short term. James offered a grim smile. "I'm pretty sure there's nothing ideal about what's happening today." The young woman nodded in agreement as she pulled herself back to her feet. She reached into her back pocket, pulling out a couple packets of pills and handing them over to James. "Take one pack of these now, and the other when the pain returns," she instructed. James examined the unmarked packets with raised eyebrows. "So these are the good stuff then?" "Very much so," she confirmed with a slight nod. "You'll feel a little woozy when they kick in, but I can guarantee you won't feel that leg as much." James pocketed the medicine gratefully. "Thank you for your help." Before the woman could respond, her companion called out urgently from a few yards away. "Come on, we have to go." The young woman gave James one last sympathetic look before hurrying toward her friend. They quickly piled into a sedan parked nearby and sped off, tires crunching on the gravel as they disappeared into the night. As their taillights faded into the distance, Brooks emerged from the clinic building, carrying a bag that appeared to be stuffed with medical supplies. His expression was grim, but he seemed composed despite what he must have witnessed inside. "You robbing the place?" James asked, attempting to lighten the mood. Brooks's face remained serious as he approached. "I just shot 3 people in the face, so a little light shoplifting isn't that big of a deal." James's attempt at humor vanished instantly, replaced by genuine concern. You shot 3 people in the face? Christ, man, are you okay? Brooks paused, looking down at the bag in his hands. Well, if I'm being honest. He trailed off for a moment before a slight smirk crossed his face. I shot 2 of them in the face. One of them was in the back of the head. I know you're all about dark humor, man, but good Lord, that's dark, James replied, shaking his head in disbelief. Brooks's smirk faded, replaced by a more vulnerable expression that James rarely saw on his friend's face. I'm just trying to process the shock, that's all. I don't really want to think about what I did or what I might have to do before the night's out. The weight of Brooks's words hung between them in the darkness. This was no longer just about a strange incident at sea or a bite from a crazed security guard. Whatever was happening was spreading, and they were caught in the middle of it. Fair enough, James conceded. Come on, I need to get home to Nancy. Brooks helped James into the passenger seat before circling around to the driver's side. As the engine rumbled to life, James pulled out his cell phone, staring at the screen with his finger hovering over Nancy's contact. Brooks pulled the truck out of the clinic parking lot and onto the main road, pausing at the junction to let James make his call. But James just sat there, staring at the phone without dialing. Are you going to call her or not? Brooks finally asked, glancing sideways at his friend. James looked troubled, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the phone screen. I tried 6 times while you were in there. Nobody answered. That could be for a million different reasons, Brooks replied, trying to sound reassuring. Brooks, James began, his voice heavy with unspoken fears. I'm serious, man, a million different reasons, Brooks insisted, shifting the truck into drive. The doctor gave her some strong meds and she's knocked out. She's in the bathroom. Her sister finally convinced her to leave your sorry ass, so she's ignoring you. Brooks let out a forced laugh at the last suggestion, prompting a weak chuckle from James, but the humor felt hollow, a thin disguise for the fear they both felt. There was a much more likely reason Nancy wasn't answering, one neither man wanted to voice aloud. Come on, man, let's get you home, Brooks said softly, pulling onto the road. James nodded, glancing down at his watch. It was just after 7, and darkness had completely shrouded the highway. Brooks switched on the headlights, the beams cutting through the night as they accelerated toward town. He maintained a steady speed, faster than the limit but not recklessly so. As they approached an intersection about a mile from the clinic, Brooks slowed the truck. Through the windshield, James could make out the outlines of several vehicles stopped at odd angles, hazard lights blinking in the darkness. Rather than approach what appeared to be a small accident, Brooks made a hard left turn at the next street, deviating from their direct route home. What are you doing? James asked, shifting in his seat to look back at the intersection they'd avoided. Just playing it extra safe, that's all, Brooks replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. James didn't press the issue. The pain medication was beginning to take effect, creating a pleasant numbness in his leg and a slight haziness in his thoughts. Brooks knew where he was going, so James just sat back and enjoyed the ride, in more ways than one. The backroads route took them through quiet residential neighborhoods, most houses showing signs of normal evening activities. Lights on, cars in driveways, occasional figures visible through windows. It was almost possible to believe that what they'd experienced was isolated, confined to the marina and the clinic. Almost. After navigating a maze of side streets for about 10 minutes, Brooks turned onto a familiar road. James's house came into view just a couple of blocks down. It was a modest 2-story coastal home, painted a faded blue with white trim, set back slightly from the street and partially obscured by tall palm trees. Brooks suddenly smacked James on the chest, pointing to a strange car parked in front of the house. A red sedan that Brooks didn't recognize. Whose car is that? Brooks asked, slowing the truck as they approached. James squinted through the windshield, recognition dawning. Nancy's sister. Brooks paused, clearly unsure how to respond. Well, look at the bright side, Brooks finally said. It's not the worst thing we've encountered today. Clearly you haven't met her, James replied dryly. Come on, let's get me home. Brooks let out a small chuckle as they drove the remaining distance to the house, pulling the truck into the driveway beside Nancy's sensible blue compact. He cut the engine and came around to help James out of the vehicle, but James waved him off. I'm good, man, the drugs are really kicking in, he insisted, carefully lowering himself to the ground and testing his weight on the injured leg. The pain was there, but muted, manageable. Brooks nodded, allowing his friend to walk on his own but staying close in case James stumbled. They moved up the short path to the side door, the one that led directly into the kitchen. James fished his keys from his pocket, his movement slightly clumsy from the medication, and slid the key into the lock as quietly as possible. The door opened with a slight creak, revealing the darkened kitchen beyond. James stepped in first, not calling out as he normally would, just in case things were bad. Brooks followed, gently closing the door behind them and turning the deadbolt. The house was unnervingly quiet. Normally when Nancy's sister visited, the television would be on, or music playing, or at the very least the sound of conversation. But now there was nothing but silence. James moved gingerly through the kitchen toward the living room, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Only the small light above the stove provided any illumination, casting long shadows across the floor. He paused at the edge of the hallway, peering down the corridor toward the bedroom at the far end. The bedroom door stood wide open, unusual since Nancy preferred it closed when she was sick to block out noise and light. James took one more step forward, and the floorboard beneath his foot let out a loud creak that seemed to echo through the silent house. A second later, a figure appeared in the bedroom doorway, a silhouette shrouded in darkness. It was a woman, her outline familiar yet somehow wrong, her posture unnaturally rigid. Before James could speak, she launched herself forward, sprinting down the hallway toward them with that same jerky, inhuman movement they'd seen in the zombified security guard. "Oh shit, she's one of them," James shouted, instinctively retreating. He tried to backtrack, but his injured leg betrayed him, causing him to stumble backward just as Nancy's sister reached them. Brooks reached out, trying to grab his friend, but he wasn't able to break James's fall. The zombie ignored Brooks completely, diving straight onto James's chest and immediately going for his throat. James felt the searing pain as teeth sank into the nape of his neck, tearing through flesh and muscle. "James!" Brooks shouted, horror evident in his voice. The creature pulled back with a chunk of flesh, blood spraying in an arc across the hallway wall. Brooks lurched forward, tackling the zombie and knocking it off James. They rolled across the floor until Brooks managed to pin it face down, straddling its back as it thrashed beneath him. James pressed his hand to his neck, trying to stem the flow of blood as he struggled to his feet. His vision swam, partly from blood loss, partly from the medication. Through sheer force of will, he staggered to the nearby sofa, where Nancy kept her knitting supplies. He grabbed a long metal knitting needle from the basket, clutching it like a dagger as he lurched back toward the struggling pair. With a final burst of strength, James drove the needle directly into the zombie's ear canal, pushing it in as far as it would go. The creature went instantly limp beneath Brooks, who scrambled away from the now still body, his breathing ragged. "I've been waiting 20 years to do that," James gasped, a dark smile crossing his pale face. He tried to remain standing, taking a few deep breaths, but the blood loss was too much. His knees buckled and he slid down the wall to the floor, leaving a crimson smear in his wake. "My God, man, are you okay?" Brooks asked, rushing to his friend's side. James tried to speak, but blood had begun filling his throat, causing him to cough and sputter. Red foam appeared at the corners of his mouth as he struggled to breathe. "Let me get a towel," Brooks said desperately, starting to rise. James reached out with surprising strength, grabbing his friend's arm to stop him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Brooks knew what James already understood. It was over. The wound was too severe, the blood loss too great. "I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry," Brooks said, his voice breaking as he knelt beside his dying friend. James nodded weakly, his grip tightening momentarily on Brooks' hand. "You've been a great friend, Brooks," he managed between labored breaths. "Take the boat and get out of here." Brooks felt tears welling in his eyes as he watched his friend slipping away. They'd known each other for decades, shared countless fishing trips and beers and stories, and now it was ending, here in this darkened hallway, with James bleeding out from a wound that shouldn't exist in any sane world. "I will, man, I will," Brooks promised, his voice thick with emotion. James's lips curled into a faint smile before his eyelids fluttered closed. "And tell Nancy that I love her," he whispered. Before Brooks could respond, James went still, his hand going slack in Brooks's grip. The only sound in the hallway was Brooks's ragged breathing as he stared down at his friend's motionless form, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. A minute passed, perhaps two. Brooks remained frozen in place, unable or unwilling to move away from his friend's body. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, James began to stir. It started with slight twitches of his fingers, then a rolling motion of his head. His eyes snapped open, but they were no longer the eyes Brooks knew. The warmth and intelligence had been replaced by a vacant, predatory stare. "Jesus Christ!" Brooks exclaimed, scrambling backward across the floor. The thing that had been James lurched upward, moving with the same uncoordinated but determined motions as the other infected they'd encountered. It fixed its gaze on Brooks and began crawling forward, mouth opening to reveal teeth still stained with its own blood. Brooks continued retreating until his back hit the opposite wall. His hand moved instinctively to the gun tucked in his waistband, pulling it out with trembling fingers. He raised the revolver, aiming it at what had once been his best friend. "I'm sorry, James," he whispered, squeezing the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, the flash momentarily illuminating the hallway. The bullet struck James in the forehead, exiting through the back of his skull and embedding itself in the wall. The zombie collapsed instantly, finally and truly still. Brooks sat motionless, the gun still raised, shaking violently as the reality of what he'd just done washed over him. He had killed his best friend. The logical part of his brain knew that James was already gone, that the creature he'd shot wasn't really James anymore, but that knowledge did little to ease the crushing weight of grief and horror pressing down on him. A sudden banging noise from the back bedroom jolted Brooks from his shock. The sound was rhythmic, insistent. Something trapped and trying to get out. Brooks slowly rose to his feet, keeping the gun ready as he moved cautiously down the hallway. The banging grew louder as he approached the bedroom, accompanied now by a muffled moaning that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He paused at the threshold, taking in the scene. The bedroom was in disarray, the sheets and comforter stained dark with what could only be blood. The bedside lamp had been knocked over, and various items were scattered across the floor, as if there had been a violent struggle. The banging was coming from the closet, where the door shuddered with each impact from whatever was trapped inside. It only took a moment for Brooks to realize what, or rather who, it must be. "Nancy." Brooks approached the closet door slowly, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. The banging intensified as he drew near, as if the creature inside sensed his presence. He stood inches away from the door, listening to the desperate scratching and moaning from within. He raised the revolver, placing the barrel directly against the wood where Nancy's head would be. His finger curled around the trigger as he pulled the hammer back with his thumb, the mechanical click seeming impossibly loud in the quiet house. Brooks paused, his hand steady despite the emotional turmoil raging within him. He thought about James and Nancy, about the life they'd built together, about the love they'd shared for over 25 years. "Nancy, James loved you very much," he said softly, his voice breaking on the final word. He let out a deep sigh as he pulled the trigger, the gunshot echoing throughout the house before everything fell silent. Chapter 6. Brooks sat on the edge of the blood-soaked bed, struggling to compose himself after putting bullets into his lifelong friend and his wife. His hands still trembled slightly, the revolver feeling unnaturally heavy in his grip. The acrid smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, mingling with the coppery scent of blood that seemed to permeate the entire house. He knew that the bodies he had put down weren't really his friends, at least not anymore. James and Nancy had already been gone, replaced by mindless, violent shells that merely wore their faces. But that intellectual understanding did little to ease the crushing weight of what he'd just done. Regardless of the semantics he used to justify the shootings, one fact remained. His friends were gone. The silence of the house pressed in on him, broken only by the distant wail of sirens from somewhere in town. It was a sound that would have been reassuring just hours ago, a sign that help was on its way. Now, Brooks wondered if the emergency services were even functioning anymore, or if they too had been overwhelmed by whatever madness was spreading through the community. "So what are you going to do now, man?" he asked aloud, his voice sounding alien in the quiet room. Are you going to sit here and wait to die, or are you going to get your ass back to that boat? The boat. James's last words echoed in his mind. Take the boat and get out of here. It was a lifeline, perhaps the only viable option left. Whatever was happening seemed to be spreading rapidly through the town, and staying put was simply waiting for death to find him. Brooks looked down at the handgun in his lap, his mind briefly contemplating the unthinkable before shaking it off. With practiced movements, he popped out the cylinder, examining its contents. Only one bullet remained. Think, man, think, he muttered, forcing his mind to focus on the practical. What do you need? Food, water. Well, not water, remember James put that desalinization thing on the boat. Just food. Brooks glanced down again at his one-use weapon, the reality of his situation sinking in further. And maybe a more reliable weapon. It's going to be dangerous getting to the dock. The thought galvanized him into action. Dwelling on what had happened would help no one, least of all himself. If he was going to honor James's final request, he needed to move now, while he still could. Brooks moved with purpose, leaving the bedroom and making his way to the kitchen. He grabbed a canvas grocery bag from a hook by the pantry and began loading up every shelf-stable food item he could find. Canned goods, energy bars, bags of nuts, and a large jar of peanut butter all went into the bag. He added a couple of bottles of water, though he knew the boat's desalination system would provide more once he was at sea. He looked at the meager collection, mentally calculating how long it would last. A week at most, even with careful rationing. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. It's a good thing we left the fish on board, he remarked to the empty kitchen, remembering the cooler full of their day's catch that still sat in the boat. Brooks slung the bag over his shoulder, approaching the side door and carefully peering out the window to check for any unwelcome visitors. The driveway appeared clear, the truck sitting undisturbed where they had left it. When he was confident the coast was clear, he stepped outside, quickly making his way to the truck and tossing the bag of provisions into the back. The cool night air felt good against his skin, helping to clear his head a bit, but being out in the open made him acutely aware of his vulnerability. The revolver with its single remaining bullet offered little security. "Weapons, I need weapons," he murmured, scanning the area. His gaze fell on the small storage shed at the side of the house. James had always been meticulous about maintaining his home, and Brooks knew the shed would be well stocked with tools. He moved quickly to the door, finding it secured with a padlock. Without hesitation, he smashed the lock with the butt of his revolver, the metallic crack echoing in the quiet neighborhood. The door swung open, revealing rows of neatly organized tools hanging from a pegboard wall. It wasn't an arsenal, but it was certainly better than facing the night unarmed. "It's better than nothing," Brooks said, surveying his options. He grabbed a hammer, testing its weight in his hand before tucking it into his belt. A couple of long screwdrivers followed, their pointed tips promising to be effective against the creatures he'd encountered. He considered taking more, but didn't want to weigh himself down unnecessarily. "Get moving, man," he urged himself. "You don't want to be caught out here when things get really bad." Brooks didn't have proof it was going to get worse, but his gut feeling told him that the situation was only going to deteriorate as the night wore on. The scattered incidents they'd witnessed so far were likely just the beginning. He retreated back to the truck, climbing into the driver's seat and inserting the key into the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, a reassuringly normal sound in a world that had suddenly become anything but. Brooks put the vehicle in reverse, but paused before backing out of the driveway. He turned, looking back at the darkened house one last time. "Rest easy, James. I'll catch you in the next life, buddy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Then, steeling himself, Brooks pulled out into the street. He hit the gas, wanting to put some distance between himself and the home that now stood as a tomb for his closest friends. The headlights cut through the darkness as he navigated the residential streets, taking the back routes to avoid the main thoroughfares where trouble might be more likely to find him. As he drove, Brooks kept a vigilant eye on his surroundings. Occasionally, he spotted movement in the shadows. Figures running with that distinctive jerky gait that marked them as infected. Luckily, none paid him any attention, too fixated on other prey to notice the passing truck. After several minutes of driving, Brooks realized he was becoming disoriented in the maze of similar-looking suburban streets. He slowed the truck, trying to get his bearings in the unfamiliar neighborhood. James had lived here for decades, but Brooks only visited a few times a year, and usually they drove directly from the house to the marina. "Where the hell am I?" he muttered, peering through the windshield at street signs that offered no meaningful guidance. Finally, he recognized a small corner market that they had passed earlier in the day. With his sense of direction restored, Brooks turned the truck toward the main road, knowing he would need to cross it to reach the docks on the other side. "Well, this looks like as good a place as any to cross," he decided, approaching an intersection that appeared relatively quiet. Brooks slowed as he reached the main road, stopping completely at the junction to check for traffic or other potential hazards. It was clear to his right, but when he looked left, he spotted a two-vehicle accident about 50 yards away. One vehicle was a pickup truck similar to the one he was driving, now resting against a light post off the road. It appeared empty, no movement visible inside. The other was a sedan that had flipped upside down, its back portion crushed, as if the truck had slammed into it with considerable force. As Brooks squinted through the darkness, he noticed movement around the sedan. Two figures were circling the overturned car, periodically lunging at it and pounding on the windows. More creatures, trying to get to whoever might be trapped inside. With a growing sense of dread, Brooks realized there were indeed survivors in the car. He could make out two people, a young man who appeared dazed or injured behind the wheel, and a young woman who was fully conscious and terrified as the zombies continued their assault on the vehicle. As if sensing his presence, the young woman turned her head, making direct eye contact with Brooks through the broken window of her car. Even at this distance, the silent plea in her eyes was unmistakable. Brooks sat frozen behind the steering wheel for a long moment, contemplating his options. The smart play would be to keep driving, to focus on his own survival as James had urged him to do. Getting involved could only increase his risk. "Damn it, you just had to make eye contact, didn't you?" he muttered, already knowing what he was going to do. Brooks turned the wheel sharply, aiming the truck directly toward the accident scene. He accelerated quickly, pressing the horn with his palm to create as much noise as possible. "Yeah, come get me, assholes," he shouted as he barreled toward the scene. The ploy worked exactly as he'd hoped. Drawn to the noise and movement, both zombies abandoned their attack on the sedan and rushed toward the approaching truck. Brooks kept his foot heavy on the accelerator, aiming the front end of the truck directly at the creatures. The impact sent both zombies flying through the air, their bodies landing hard on the pavement several yards away. Brooks didn't wait to see if they would get up again. He slammed on the brakes, leaving the engine running as he jumped out and rushed to the overturned sedan. He reached the driver's side door first, grabbing the handle and pulling with all his strength. The crumpled metal groaned in protest but finally gave way, the door swinging open to reveal the young man still suspended upside down by his seatbelt, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Brooks quickly moved to the passenger side where the young woman was trapped, pulling open her door and reaching his hands inside to help. "Brace yourself against the roof. I'll take care of your belt," he instructed, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Okay, I'll do it," the woman replied, placing her hands on the roof below her. Brooks winced as he saw her palms pressing into the shattered glass that lined the interior roof of the car, but there was no time to worry about minor cuts. He reached up and released her seatbelt buckle, trying his best to catch her as she fell. He managed to break her fall enough to prevent serious injury, pulling her out of the vehicle and onto the pavement. "You have to help Simon," she pleaded immediately, pointing to her boyfriend still trapped in the driver's seat. Brooks nodded and hurried around to the other side of the car again. He was acutely aware of their exposure, knowing that the noise from the collision with the zombies might attract more of them. "Watch out for those people," he warned the woman, nodding toward the two figures he'd hit with the truck. They weren't moving yet, but that could change at any moment. The young woman nodded, taking up a position where she could keep watch as Brooks returned his attention to freeing the driver. He reached into the car, shaking the young man's shoulder to rouse him from his dazed state. "What's going on?" Simon asked groggily, blinking as consciousness returned. "Relax, I'm getting you out of here," Brooks replied, already reaching for the seatbelt. "Where's Michelle?" Simon asked, his concern for his companion evident even in his confused state. "She's fine," Brooks assured him, Just worry about bracing yourself." Simon complied, placing his hands against the roof of the car as Brooks had instructed Michelle to do. Brooks released the seatbelt catch, trying to guide Simon's descent to minimize the impact. The confined space made the task difficult, and they struggled to maneuver into a position where Simon could exit the vehicle. Just as they were making progress, Michelle's panicked voice cut through the night air. "Oh my God, they're coming." Brooks reacted instantly, pulling back with all his strength to extract Simon from the car. They tumbled onto the pavement together, Brooks scrambling to his feet and turning just as a pair of zombies reached them. Not the ones he'd hit with the truck, but new threats, drawn by the commotion. His instincts took over, putting himself between the creatures and the much younger Michelle to protect her. One of the zombies lunged forward, teeth bared, and latched onto Brooks's forearm. Pain shot through his arm as teeth broke skin, but he managed to grapple with the second zombie, grabbing it by the throat to hold it at bay. With a powerful twist of his body, Brooks shook off the biting attacker, causing it to stumble backward. Seizing the moment, he delivered a vicious kick that sent the creature sprawling to the ground. Without pausing, he pushed the second zombie backward with all his might, lifting it off its feet and slamming it down on top of the first. The two creatures thrashed beneath him as Brooks maintained pressure, keeping them pinned to the ground. With his free hand, he drew the revolver from his waistband, pressing the barrel against the top zombie's forehead. One pull of the trigger, and the bullet tore through the first creature's skull before continuing into the second, silencing both threats with a single shot. "My God, are you okay?" Michelle asked, her voice trembling as she stared at the bite wound on his arm. Brooks looked down at the injury, blood seeping through the torn fabric of his shirt. He knew exactly what it meant. He had seen James transform after receiving a similar wound, but there was no point in scaring the young couple who already had enough to deal with. "I'll live," he lied, standing tall and moving back toward the truck. "Come on, we have to get out of here." Simon had managed to get to his feet, though he was clearly still disoriented from the crash. "Where are we going to go?" he asked, leaning on Michelle for support. Brooks turned to face them. "You can go anywhere you want to go, but if you want to live, I suggest you come with me to my boat." Chapter 7. Brooks drove the three of them down towards the docks, the pain in his arm threatening to overwhelm him. Each heartbeat sent a fresh wave of agony through the ragged bite wound, and he could feel a concerning warmth spreading up his forearm. He knew what that meant, though he tried not to dwell on it. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating empty streets that just hours earlier had been filled with normal evening traffic. Now, shadows moved between buildings, and the occasional distant scream punctuated the night air. The town was changing, transforming into something unrecognizable. Simon and Michelle sat next to him in the truck's cab, both looking at him with concern. Michelle's face was scratched from the accident, and Simon's forehead bore a nasty gash, but compared to Brooks' bite wound, their injuries seemed trivial. "Thank you for saving us," Michelle said, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over them. Brooks nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "You're welcome, Michelle." She looked intently at the wound on his arm, as if she was trying to will it to be healed. The bite mark was clearly visible through his torn sleeve, blood continuing to seep through the fabric. "Once we stop, I can try and patch that up for you," Michelle offered. Brooks knew it was pointless. No amount of first aid would prevent what was coming, but he appreciated the gesture nonetheless. "That would be nice." Michelle shifted in her seat, clearly trying to find some sense of normalcy in the chaos they'd been thrust into. "I'm Michelle, and this is my boyfriend, Simon. It's nice to meet y'all. My name's Brooks." Simon leaned forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "Well, Brooks, do you have any idea of what's going on? One second we're driving down to the restaurant for dinner, and the next we're upside down in the middle of the road with people trying to break in." Brooks considered how much to tell them. They'd seen enough to know something was terribly wrong, but understanding the full horror of what was happening might be too much too soon. "Whatever's happening isn't good, and it's happening all over the island," he said carefully. Then, deciding they deserved the truth, he added, "Oh, and those people, they weren't people." Simon and Michelle exchanged curious glances, not sure what to make of that information. "What do you mean they're not people?" Michelle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brooks tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the familiar action grounding him amid the surreal conversation. I wish I could tell you, but they're not people, at least not anymore. How do you know? Simon pressed, clearly skeptical despite what he'd witnessed at the accident scene. Brooks let out a deep sigh, pain in his heart at the thought of what he'd experienced just a short time ago. The images of James and Nancy were still fresh in his mind, first as they died, then as they transformed into something inhuman. Because I watched my best friend turn into one of them right in front of my eyes, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. He died, then woke up and tried to take a chunk out of me. Didn't recognize me at all. Simon wasn't sure how to respond, looking out the window instead. Michelle took a little more care, putting her hand on Brooks's shoulder to comfort him. I'm sorry for your loss, she said quietly. Thanks, Brooks replied, uncomfortable with the sympathy but appreciating it nonetheless. Simon continued staring out the window, his body tensing as he spotted movement in the shadows between buildings. How much further away is your boat? About another half-mile, Brooks answered, checking the side mirrors for any signs of pursuit. Won't be long now. The truck cab fell silent as they kept driving, each lost in their own thoughts. Brooks focused on the road ahead, scanning for obstacles or threats. The pain in his arm was intensifying, and he could feel a strange heaviness beginning to spread through his body. He pushed the sensation aside, knowing he needed to get these kids to safety before he succumbed to whatever was happening to him. After a few more minutes of driving, Brooks finally spotted the turn to the marina driveway. He slowed the truck, beginning to make the turn when he was forced to slam on the brakes. A pickup truck with a boat on a trailer had jackknifed across the entrance, effectively blocking the way forward. The three of them leaned forward, trying to see past the obstacle. There was no sign of movement around the truck or trailer, but the angle prevented them from seeing what might be waiting on the other side. What do we do now? Michelle asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Brooks didn't hesitate. We get out and walk. Are you sure that's wise? Simon questioned, eyeing the darkened area beyond the truck with obvious concern. Nope, Brooks admitted frankly, but I know there's a boat waiting for us on the other side, and the only way we're getting there is on foot. So, shake a leg, kid. Without waiting for further discussion, Brooks stepped out of the truck, reaching down to grab the hammer he'd placed on the floorboard. He walked around to the front of the vehicle, the headlights illuminating his path as he waited for the two younger survivors to join him. Once they were beside him, he pulled out the two screwdrivers from his belt, handing one to each of them. What are we supposed to do with these? Simon asked, examining the tool skeptically. Aim for the head, Brooks instructed. I don't know if other stuff works, but I know a shot to the dome seems to do the trick. Both Simon and Michelle exchanged worried glances before falling into line behind Brooks. He retrieved the bag of provisions from the back of the truck, slinging it over his shoulder before leading them toward the jackknifed vehicle. Brooks approached cautiously, climbing up into the bed of the abandoned pickup to get a better view. Peering through the back window, he noted that the passenger door stood wide open, and dark stains that could only be blood covered the dashboard. Okay, we might have company up ahead, he warned, jumping back down to join the others. He took a moment to orient himself, recalling the layout of the marina from his earlier visit. The boat is in slip 22, it'll be down on the right of the dock. If I tell you to, get on board and push off from the dock. What about you? Michelle asked, concern evident in her voice. If I'm telling you that, it means we're in trouble, Brooks explained matter-of-factly. So, wait for me to swim over before heading off to the ocean. Neither Michelle nor Simon looked thrilled with the plan, but they understood the logic behind it. The three of them continued forward, skirting around the jackknifed trailer and crossing the parking lot toward the marina entrance. Brooks handed the bag of food to Michelle as they approached, wanting his hands free in case they encountered trouble. His caution proved warranted as they drew closer to the docks. 3 zombies milled about near the entrance, 2 of them kneeling and feeding on some unfortunate victim, while the third roamed nearby, as if searching for more prey. Get to that boat no matter what, Brooks instructed in a hushed tone. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the keys to James's boat and pressing them into Simon's palm. "Let me be the diversion," Simon offered, his expression determined. "You're injured and, let's be honest, I'm in better shape than you are." Brooks shook his head firmly. "Not a chance, kid. I've been in enough brawls in my life to know how to handle myself. Just get you and your girl over to the boat." He fixed Simon with a hard stare. "And for the love of all that is holy, don't leave without me." Simon nodded reluctantly, closing his fingers around the keys. Brooks moved away from their position behind a parked car, circling around to approach from a different angle. He found cover behind another vehicle about 20 yards away, taking a moment to steel himself for what came next. Drawing a deep breath, Brooks raised his hammer and brought it down hard on the ground, the metal head striking the pavement with a resounding ping that echoed through the night air. The effect was immediate. All three zombies snapped their heads in his direction, abandoning their grisly meal and sprinting toward the source of the noise. "Run, now!" Brooks shouted to Simon and Michelle, watching as they broke from cover and dashed toward the dock entrance. The plan was working perfectly. The zombies were focused entirely on him, leaving the path clear for the young couple. But as Simon and Michelle approached the dock, an unexpected complication arose. The corpse that the zombies had been feeding on began to stir, slowly sitting up and looking around with vacant, hungry eyes. It immediately locked on to the movement of Simon and Michelle, lunging forward with surprising speed despite its ravaged condition. Simon reacted instinctively, flipping the screwdriver in his hand to position it like a dagger. As the newly reanimated creature reached for him, he drove the tool forward with all his strength. The tip connected with the zombie's eye socket, penetrating deep and causing the creature to collapse instantly. Meanwhile, Brooks faced his own battle. The three zombies charged him, the lead one several steps ahead of its companions. Brooks stood his ground, adjusting his grip on the hammer and raising it in readiness. "Yeah, that's right, come get some," he muttered, timing his swing with practiced precision. The hammer came down with devastating force, connecting squarely with the first zombie's skull. The crack of breaking bone echoed in the night air as the creature dropped to the ground, instantly still. Brooks glanced toward the docks, relieved to see Simon and Michelle disappearing between the rows of moored boats. He turned his attention back to the remaining two zombies, which were now approaching side by side, arms outstretched and mouths open in feral snarls. Rather than attempting another hammer strike, Brooks lowered his shoulder and charged forward. His considerable size and momentum plowed through the creatures, knocking them aside like bowling pins. One fell hard to the pavement, while the other careened into the tailgate of a parked truck. Brooks didn't pause to finish them off. With the path momentarily clear, he broke into a run, heading for the dock as fast as his injured body would allow. His lungs burned and his wounded arm throbbed, but adrenaline kept him moving forward. He reached the wooden planks of the dock, his footfalls creating hollow thuds that seemed unnaturally loud in the otherwise quiet marina. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed his fears. The two zombies were already back on their feet and in pursuit, moving with that unnervingly rapid gait that defied their state of decay. Ahead, Brooks could see Simon and Michelle had reached Slip 22. They were following his instructions perfectly, pushing James's boat away from the dock even as Simon worked to start the engine. It was exactly what Brooks had told them to do, but the reality of swimming to the boat while being pursued suddenly seemed much more daunting than it had in theory. The zombies were gaining on him, their inhuman moans growing louder with each passing second. Brooks knew he wouldn't make it to the boat before they reached him. Making a split-second decision, he veered off course, diving suddenly into an empty slip to his right. The cold water hit him like a physical blow, momentarily stealing his breath. Brooks forced himself to start swimming immediately, powerful strokes carrying him away from the edge of the dock. Behind him, he heard the distinctive splash of the zombies following him into the water. Brooks didn't look back, focusing all his energy on reaching the boat that was now drifting several yards out from the dock. The salt water stung his open wound, but he pushed through the pain, arms and legs working in desperate rhythm. He felt fingertips brush against his shoes, the zombies closing the distance despite the water's resistance. For a terrifying moment, he thought one of them might grab hold, but neither managed to secure a grip. Simon had the boat's engine running now, the gentle purr offering a beacon of hope as Brooks continued his desperate swim. Michelle stood at the side, reaching out toward him as he approached. "Over here," she called, extending her arm as far as she could without falling overboard. Brooks made a final push, closing the gap between himself and the boat. Michelle's fingers closed around his wrist, and with Simon's help they struggled to pull his waterlogged body aboard. It was an awkward, undignified process, but eventually Brooks found himself sprawled on the deck, gasping for breath as water pooled beneath him. "Are you okay?" Michelle asked, kneeling beside him with worry etched across her face. Brooks tried to speak, but could only manage ragged breaths, his chest heaving with the exertion. Instead, he raised his thumb in a weary but definitive thumbs-up gesture, prompting a relieved smile from Michelle. "Take your time and catch your breath," Simon said from the controls. "I'll get us out to sea." Chapter 8. 8:55 p.m. The boat cut smoothly through the dark waters, putting distance between them and the horror they'd left behind. Simon stood at the controls, handling the vessel with increasing confidence despite having only minimal experience. Brooks remained sprawled on the deck, gradually regaining his breath after the desperate swim to safety. Michelle knelt beside him, examining his arm with concern. "We should get this cleaned up," she said, gently pulling back the torn sleeve to reveal the bite wound. The salt water had washed away most of the blood, but the ragged punctures where teeth had broken skin were clearly visible in the boat's running lights. Brooks nodded wordlessly, knowing it was pointless but unwilling to discourage her efforts. He watched as she rummaged through the boat's emergency kit, finding antiseptic and bandages. The sting of the disinfectant barely registered compared to the deeper, unsettling warmth that continued to spread through his arm and into his chest. "How far should we go?" Simon called from the helm. Brooks pulled himself to a sitting position, wincing slightly as he did so. "About a mile out should do it. Far enough that we can't be reached, close enough to see what's happening." Simon nodded, adjusting their course slightly before reducing speed. After a few more minutes, he powered down the boat completely, cutting the engine and allowing the vessel to drift to a gentle stop. They were exactly where Brooks had suggested. Close enough to see the outlines of buildings along the shore, but far enough away to feel relatively safe. Simon moved to the rear of the ship, retrieving the anchor and tossing it overboard with a splash. The chain rattled as it paid out, eventually going taut as the anchor caught on the seabed below. With the boat secured, Simon returned to the controls, his eyes falling on a piece of equipment mounted to the dash. "This thing works, doesn't it?" he asked excitedly, picking up the radio handset. Brooks finished letting Michelle bandage his arm before responding. "Yeah, but there's nobody to call." "What do you mean?" Simon asked, clearly puzzled. "What about the police, the Coast Guard?" "We tried that already," Brooks explained, remembering James's increasingly frustrated attempts to reach anyone who might help. "The Coast Guard has just up and vanished." Michelle paused in her first aid efforts, looking up with concern. "What do you mean, vanished?" "I mean, they're just gone," Brooks said with a shrug. "My friend tried repeatedly to reach them after we found that abandoned boat. Nothing but static in response." Simon turned the radio over in his hands, unwilling to give up so easily. "But shouldn't we try?" Brooks could see the hope in the young man's eyes, the belief that somewhere, someone in authority was working to restore order, to make sense of the madness that had overtaken their world. He didn't have the heart to crush that hope entirely, not yet. "There's time for that," he said gently. "I kind of skipped dinner tonight, and from the sounds of it, you did too. What do you say to some food first?" Simon and Michelle exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them before they both nodded in agreement. "Do you have any way to cook on this boat?" Michelle asked, securing the bandage on Brooks's arm with a final piece of tape. "There's a little kitchen below deck that should do the trick," Brooks replied, gesturing toward the cabin entrance. James had always kept the boat well equipped, priding himself on being able to prepare a decent meal even while at sea. Simon retrieved the bag of provisions Brooks had gathered from James's house, examining its contents with a slight frown. "It looks like our options are canned soup or canned meat. Or, hey, there's a bag of rice too," he reported, his tone less than enthusiastic. Brooks couldn't help but laugh at Simon's obvious disappointment. "Why don't you take a look in the cooler there?" he suggested, pointing to the large ice chest secured to the deck. Simon nodded, setting aside the bag and reaching for the cooler lid. His expression transformed instantly as he peered inside, eyes widening at the sight of the day's catch, still preserved on ice. "Oh, now we're talking," he said appreciatively. "I don't suppose you know how to clean and gut a fish, do you?" Brooks asked, already suspecting the answer based on Simon's city boy demeanor. "He doesn't, but I do," Michelle interjected with a surprising confidence. Brooks raised his eyebrows, giving her an appraising look. "A woman after my own heart." Michelle chuckled as she got up and walked over to the cooler, examining the impressive selection of fish inside. "I grew up with 3 brothers, and my dad was always taking us out fishing and hunting. If you can hunt it or pull it out of the water, chances are I've killed it, cooked it, and cleaned it." Brooks looked over to Simon, his expression serious despite the twinkle in his eye. "Brother, you need to put a ring on that finger." Michelle playfully looked over at her boyfriend, who could only smile and shake his head in response, clearly having heard similar sentiments before. "If you need a hand with things," Brooks began, starting to push himself up from his seated position. Michelle shook her head, interrupting him as she selected a particularly plump fish from the cooler. "You've done plenty tonight. You just sit there and enjoy the view. I'll let you know when dinner's ready." Brooks nodded in appreciation, settling back down as Michelle disappeared below deck with her prize. The sound of water running and cabinets opening soon drifted up from below, along with the soft clatter of kitchenware being arranged. Brooks turned his attention to the shoreline, savoring the oddly beautiful view. Despite the chaos they'd witnessed, the coastal town looked almost normal from this distance. Lights still burned in many of the houses and businesses, creating a serene tableau against the night sky. If he didn't know better, he might believe it was just another peaceful evening on the water. Simon walked over, taking a seat beside him on the cushioned bench that ran along the stern. For a moment neither spoke, both contemplating the deceptive tranquility before them. "I really can't thank you enough for coming to our rescue back there," Simon finally said, breaking the silence. Brooks shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude now, as he had been with sympathy earlier. "You're welcome, Simon. I saw that Michelle needed help, so I did what needed to be done." He held up his injured arm, now properly bandaged thanks to Michelle's careful ministrations. "Even if it did cost me?" Simon's expression grew more serious, his eyes fixed on the bandaged wound. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. You said you watched your friend turn into one of those things. It didn't happen to be due to one of those bites, did it?" Brooks recognized the look on Simon's face. The young man was connecting dots, making the same grim observations that Brooks himself had made. He took a moment to contemplate before nodding in agreement. "He got his throat ripped out by his sister-in-law," Brooks confirmed, the memory still fresh and painful. "When he bled out, he popped back up a few seconds later." "Do you think you're going to do the same?" Simon asked directly, though there was no accusation in his tone, just practical concern. "I'll be honest with you, Simon, I don't know," Brooks admitted, appreciating the young man's straightforwardness. "At this point, it wouldn't surprise me." The silence between them grew heavier as the implication of Brooks's words sank in. He could see Simon struggling with how to approach the delicate subject of what might happen if Brooks turned while they were all trapped together on the small boat. "I know you went through a lot to rescue us," Simon trailed off, unsure of how to phrase the question he wanted to ask. Brooks understood and decided to answer it directly, sparing Simon the awkwardness. "Don't worry, when we sleep tonight, I'll be safely locked away. If it feels like I'm going to turn into one of those things, I'll throw myself overboard." Simon stared at him with gratitude, though he clearly struggled to find an appropriate response to such a declaration. "I don't know what to say, man." "There's nothing to be said," Brooks assured him with a small smile. "I went to the trouble of rescuing you. I'd feel like a dick if I was the one who caused you to die." The dark humor broke the tension, and both men chuckled, glad to have a moment of levity amid the grim circumstances. Their attention was suddenly drawn to movement on the distant shoreline. To the right of their view, several bright flashes of light appeared near one of the piers. As they watched, brilliant bursts of blue, red, and green exploded in the night sky. Fireworks, launched from somewhere along the waterfront. "You think it's a call for help?" Simon asked, leaning forward to get a better view of the colorful display. Brooks considered the possibility, It wasn't an unreasonable assumption given the circumstances, but something about the regularity and artistic quality of the display suggested otherwise. Probably just people celebrating the end of the season, he suggested, remembering that the tourist season was winding down. Whatever it is, it's a nice way to end the day. Simon nodded as the two of them fell silent, watching the colorful fireworks continuing to go off in the distance. The spectacular bursts of light reflected on the dark water surrounding them, creating a surreal beauty. From below deck, the enticing aroma of cooking fish began to waft upward, accompanied by the soft sounds of Michelle moving about the galley. For a moment, Brooks could almost pretend they were just three friends enjoying an evening cruise, pausing to watch an impromptu fireworks display from the perfect vantage point. The illusion was comfortable, if fleeting. Brooks knew that come morning, they would need to make difficult decisions about their next steps. The bite on his arm would likely force him to make even harder choices before then. But for now, watching the sky bloom with color while the scent of a home-cooked meal filled the air, he allowed himself to savor this moment of relative peace. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly, as another burst of green and gold sparkles cascaded above the distant pier. "Yeah," Simon agreed, his voice equally soft. "Beautiful." They remained there, side by side on the bench, watching in contemplative silence as the fireworks continued to illuminate the night sky, over a world that was sure to be very different by the morning. The end.